Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into some recent news about the Mexican economy.
Sounds good.
Specifically, inflation. We'll be looking at a recent article from Mexico News Daily to see what we can learn. And get this, your grocery bill in Mexico could be affected by something as seemingly unrelated as bird flu in the United States.
Wow, that's interesting. I'm intrigued. How are those two things even related?
Well, let's find out. So to start, the article leads with the fact that Mexico's inflation rate rose slightly to 3.74% in early February 2025.
Okay.
Now, I know hearing the word inflation can sometimes cause a bit of anxiety, but I'm curious, is this increase really something to be concerned about?
That's a great question. And it's important to remember that this rate is still within Banco de Mexico's target range of 3% plus or minus 1 percentage point.
Okay.
So a small increase isn't necessarily a bad thing.
Okay, that makes sense. But what does this mean for people in Mexico on a practical level?
Right.
Let's talk about something that affects everyone. Food prices.
Absolutely. The article points out that while overall food inflation decreased, the prices of some specific items actually went up.
For example, the price of eggs in Mexico jumped by a significant 5.28%.
Mm-hmm.
And here's the kicker. It's likely due to bird flu outbreaks in the United States.
Oh, wow. Okay, so that's the connection.
Yeah. Who knew breakfast tacos could be impacted by avian flu thousands of miles away?
Right. That's fascinating. It really highlights how interconnected our world is, doesn't it? The article explains that reduced egg production in the U.S. due to the bird flu has increased demand and therefore prices for eggs in Mexico.
So it's not just about the price of eggs going up. It's about understanding the complex web of factors that contribute to these seemingly isolated price changes.
Exactly. And speaking of price changes, the article also noted that while egg prices rose, some produce, like tomatoes, nopales, squash, and onions, actually saw price drops.
That's interesting. While bananas, on the other hand, became more expensive, it seems like there's a lot of variation even within the same category of food.
There is. And these specific examples help us see how different factors play out in the market, even within a single sector, like food.
The article also touched on something that affects many people's daily lives: the price of eating out. Apparently, small, local restaurants in Mexico have increased prices by about 0.50%. It seems that inflation is making its presence felt in various ways.
It is, and that's an important point. Inflation doesn't just impact the grocery store. It ripples through different parts of the economy, from restaurants to housing and beyond.
Now, to try and manage all of this, Banco de Mexico has been using interest rate cuts. The article mentions they recently lowered their benchmark interest rate to 9.5%.
Okay.
Can you break down for us how exactly these interest rate cuts work to stimulate the economy and control inflation?
Of course. When Banco de Mexico lowers interest rates, it becomes cheaper for businesses and individuals to borrow money.
So people are more likely to take out loans for things like starting a business, buying a house, or investing in new ventures. And businesses might use those loans to expand, hire more employees, or develop new products.
That's right. This increased economic activity can help boost growth.
But how does cutting interest rates help with controlling inflation? Wouldn't encouraging more spending potentially lead to prices rising even further?
That's a valid point, and it's where the balancing act comes in.
Yeah.
Banco de Mexico has to carefully weigh the risks of stimulating the economy too much, which could lead to higher inflation down the line.
It sounds like a tricky situation. So the question is, will Banco de Mexico continue to cut interest rates in the future?
That's what economists are trying to figure out right now. The article cites several economists who believe that further rate cuts are likely. In fact, Banco de Mexico themselves recently hinted at this possibility, saying they could consider adjusting in similar magnitudes in the future.
Adjusting in similar magnitudes, huh? So they're being cautious but seem open to further adjustments.
Exactly. They're clearly keeping a close eye on the situation and weighing various factors before making any decisions.
Speaking of keeping an eye on things, the article also brought up another measure of inflation called core inflation, which is currently at 3.63% in Mexico. Can you explain what core inflation is and why it's important to consider alongside the headline inflation number?
Absolutely. Core inflation excludes volatile items like food and energy prices. These prices tend to fluctuate significantly due to factors like weather events or global supply chain disruptions like the bird flu situation we discussed earlier.
So by removing those potentially erratic price changes, we get a clearer picture of the more persistent underlying price trends in the economy.
Precisely. It helps us understand the long-term inflationary pressures that might be building up, independent of short-term shocks.
Okay, so we've got headline inflation at 3.74%, which includes everything, and core inflation at 3.63%, which filters out the more volatile elements. Both are still within Banco de Mexico's target range, which is reassuring.
It is. It suggests that while there are some price fluctuations, the overall situation is relatively stable.
But even with this stability, there are still a lot of moving parts to consider, right?
Absolutely, especially when we remember how interconnected the global economy is.
Speaking of global interconnectedness, we talked about the impact of bird flu in the U.S. on egg prices in Mexico.
Right.
I'm curious, what other seemingly unrelated global events could potentially affect Mexico's economy in surprising ways?
That's a great question. There are countless possibilities to consider. Things like changes in commodity prices, disruptions in global supply chains, political instability in other countries, shifts in trade agreements. All of these can have knock-on effects on Mexico's economy.
It really highlights the importance of staying informed about global events and understanding how they might impact different parts of the world.
It does. And it emphasizes the need to think critically about the information we consume, to connect the dots and see the bigger picture.
I completely agree. Now, the article also delved into some expert opinions on the future of Mexico's economy, particularly regarding interest rates. We already touched upon economists predicting more rate cuts, but are there any other insights we should consider?
Yes, the article quotes Kimberly Spurfechter, an emerging markets economist at Capital Economics. She describes Banco de Mexico as having a dovish stance at its last meeting.
Okay, can you explain what dovish means in this context?
It's a term used to describe a central bank's stance on monetary policy. A dovish stance generally means they are prioritizing economic growth over concerns about inflation and are therefore more likely to lower interest rates to stimulate that growth.
Ah, I see. So if Banco de Mexico is being dovish, it lends further support to the idea that more interest rate cuts might be on the horizon.
That's a reasonable conclusion to draw.
And the article also mentioned that analysts surveyed by Citibank estimate annual headline inflation at the end of February to reach 3.8%. Is that a significant jump?
It's slightly higher than the current rate, but still within Banco de Mexico's target range. It's something to monitor, but it doesn't necessarily signal an alarming trend at this point.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about headline versus core inflation, the impact of bird flu on egg prices, Banco de Mexico's interest rate decisions, and expert predictions for the future.
And we've also touched on the concept of global interconnectedness and how events in one part of the world can have far-reaching consequences.
Exactly. But with so much information to process, what are the key takeaways our listeners should remember?
Well, for me, one of the most important takeaways is that even seemingly small economic shifts can have surprising and far-reaching ripple effects. Who would have thought that bird flu in the U.S. could impact the price of eggs in Mexico?
Right. It really emphasizes how interconnected the world is and how seemingly unrelated events can create unexpected consequences. It's a reminder to stay curious, to think critically, and to keep learning. But what else stands out to you as particularly important for our listener to remember?
I think it's crucial to understand that even small changes in inflation can have a real impact on your personal finances. So, staying informed about global events, economic trends, and policy decisions can help you make more informed choices in your own life.
That's excellent advice. Whether you're planning a trip to Mexico or simply trying to make sense of the global economic landscape, staying informed is key.
Absolutely. It empowers you to navigate the complexities of today's world with more confidence and understanding.
We've talked about a lot of economic concepts today, but I'm curious, is there something from the article that particularly resonated with you or made you think about things differently?
You know, what really struck me was the fact that while some food prices are rising due to factors like the bird flu, others are actually decreasing. This reinforces the idea that economic trends are rarely straightforward, and it's important to look beyond the headlines to understand the nuances at play.
I see what you mean. It reminds us that we can't always predict how events will unfold or what the consequences might be.
Right.
It's a good reminder to stay open to new information and to embrace complexity. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's take a step back and revisit some of the key points we've discussed so far. Specifically, let's delve a little deeper into Banco de Mexico's recent interest rate decisions. What are the potential consequences, both positive and negative, of these cuts?
That's a great question to consider. While we've discussed how lower interest rates can stimulate borrowing and spending, leading to economic growth, it's equally important to acknowledge the potential downsides.
Right, there are always two sides to the coin.
Exactly. One potential consequence of lower interest rates is that they can lead to increased inflation down the line. When money is cheaper to borrow, people tend to spend more, which can drive up demand and push prices higher.
So it's a delicate balancing act for Banco de Mexico. They're trying to stimulate the economy without letting inflation get out of control.
Precisely. And finding that sweet spot can be challenging, especially in a complex and ever-changing global economy.
Now, to circle back to the article, it also mentions something about the potential long-term effects of Banco de Mexico's interest rate policies.
Yeah.
What are some of the long-term implications we should be considering?
One key implication is the potential impact on the value of the Mexican peso. When interest rates are lower, it can make investing in Mexico less attractive to foreign investors, which can lead to a depreciation of the currency.
And a weaker peso can have various consequences, right? It can make imports more expensive, which can further fuel inflation, and it can also impact the cost of travel and international transactions.
You've got it. It's a complex web of interconnected factors.
It really is. But understanding these complexities is crucial for navigating the economic landscape, whether you're an investor, a business owner, or simply someone trying to make informed decisions about your personal finances.
I couldn't agree more.
Now, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, and I want to make sure we're providing our listener with a clear and concise understanding of the key issues at play. To that end, let's revisit the topic of food prices and delve a little deeper into some of the factors that are driving the variations we're seeing.
Okay.
For example, we talked about the impact of bird flu on egg prices. But what about other produce items? Why are some prices falling while others are rising?
That's an excellent question. Let's take a closer look at the specific examples mentioned in the article. Tomatoes, nopales, squash, onions, and bananas.
Sounds good. Let's start with the items that saw price drops. Tomatoes, nopales, squash, and onions. What factors might be contributing to their lower prices?
One possibility is increased domestic production. If Mexican farmers have had a successful harvest of these crops, it would lead to a greater supply in the market, which can put downward pressure on prices.
That makes sense. And what about seasonal factors? Could the time of year be playing a role?
Absolutely. Certain crops are harvested at specific times of the year, and their prices tend to be lower during their peak season.
So it's possible that the lower prices for tomatoes, nopales, squash, and onions are simply a reflection of seasonal trends.
It's certainly a possibility. And we also need to consider factors like transportation costs, weather conditions, and even consumer demand.
Right. All of these elements can influence the prices we see at the market.
Exactly. It's a complex interplay of forces.
Now let's shift our attention to bananas, which the article mentioned have become more expensive. What factors might be driving this price increase?
One possibility is disruptions in the global supply chain. Bananas are a globally traded commodity, and any disruptions in production, transportation, or distribution can impact prices.
And speaking of global disruptions, could the ongoing bird flu outbreak in the U.S. be having any indirect effects on banana prices?
It's possible. Even though bananas and eggs are unrelated products, they both rely on functioning global supply chains. If the bird flu outbreak is causing broader disruptions in transportation or logistics, it could have spillover effects on other commodities, including bananas.
That's an interesting point. It reinforces the idea that seemingly unrelated events can have interconnected consequences.
It does, and it highlights the importance of understanding the complexities of global trade and supply chains.
Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier. The potential impact of Banco de Mexico's interest rate policies on the value of the Mexican peso.
Right. We discussed how lower interest rates can make investing in Mexico less attractive to foreign investors, which can lead to a depreciation of the currency.
Can you elaborate on why lower interest rates might make Mexico less appealing to foreign investors?
Of course. When interest rates are lower, investors can earn a lower return on their investments in Mexico compared to other countries with higher interest rates. This can make Mexico a less attractive destination for their capital.
So they might choose to invest their money elsewhere, leading to a decrease in demand for the Mexican peso.
Exactly. And that decreased demand can put downward pressure on the currency's value.
And as we discussed earlier, a weaker peso can have a variety of consequences. from making imports more expensive to impacting the cost of travel and international transactions?
It does, and it underscores the interconnectedness of global financial markets.
Now, with all of this in mind, I'm curious, what are some of the potential long-term consequences of a weaker Mexican peso?
One potential consequence is that it could make it more difficult for Mexican businesses to import goods and services, which could lead to higher prices for consumers.
Right, because those imports would be priced in stronger foreign currencies, making them more expensive to purchase with a weaker peso.
Exactly. And that could further contribute to inflationary pressures in the Mexican economy.
So there's a bit of a domino effect. Lower interest rates can lead to a weaker peso, which can make imports more expensive, which can contribute to inflation.
That's a good way to put it. It's a complex chain of events, but understanding these connections is crucial for making sense of the economic landscape.
I completely agree, and I think it's important for our listeners to remember that these economic forces don't exist in isolation. They're interconnected and constantly influencing each other.
Absolutely. It's a dynamic and ever-evolving system.
Now, before we move on to our final thoughts, I want to take a moment to revisit the concept of dovish monetary policy that we discussed earlier. We explained that a dovish stance generally means that a central bank is prioritizing economic growth over concerns about inflation.
That's right. And in the case of Banco de Mexico, their recent interest rate cuts and statements suggest that they are currently adopting a dovish approach.
But what are the potential risks associated with a dovish monetary policy? Are there any downsides to prioritizing economic growth over inflation control?
There are always potential risks and trade-offs to consider. One of the main risks associated with a dovish monetary policy is that it can lead to higher inflation in the long run. If the economy grows too quickly, it can lead to excessive demand, which can push prices higher.
So it's a balancing act for central banks. They need to stimulate growth without letting inflation spiral out of control.
Exactly. And finding that balance can be challenging, especially in an uncertain global environment.
Now, to bring this back to Mexico, what are some of the specific risks associated with Banco de Mexico's current dovish stance?
One risk is that it could lead to a further depreciation of the Mexican peso, as we discussed earlier. If foreign investors become concerned about rising inflation in Mexico, they may be less likely to invest in the country, which could put downward pressure on the currency.
Right. And a weaker peso could have various negative consequences, from making imports more expensive to impacting the cost of travel and international transactions.
It could also make it more difficult for Mexican businesses to compete in the global marketplace, as their products would become relatively more expensive compared to those from countries with stronger currencies.
So it's a complex set of interconnected risks and potential consequences.
It is, and it highlights the importance of carefully monitoring economic trends and policy decisions and understanding how they might impact the Mexican economy in the long run.
Now, before we move on to our final thoughts, I want to touch on one more important aspect of the Mexican economy: government spending. The article didn't delve into this topic in detail, but I think it's worth considering how government spending can influence inflation and economic growth.
That's a great point. Government spending can play a significant role in shaping the economic landscape. When the government spends more money, it can stimulate demand and create jobs, which can boost economic activity.
Right. And this increased economic activity can sometimes lead to higher prices, as businesses respond to increased demand by raising their prices.
Exactly. So government spending can be a double-edged sword. It can help to boost economic growth, but it can also contribute to inflationary pressures.
And it's important to note that the impact of government spending on inflation can vary depending on how the money is spent.
You're absolutely right. If the government invests in productive infrastructure projects, for example, it can lead to long-term economic benefits and potentially mitigate inflationary pressures. But if the spending is primarily focused on consumption or subsidies, it might have a more pronounced impact on inflation.
So it's not just about how much the government spends, but also how they spend it.
Precisely. The composition of government spending can have a significant impact on the overall economy.
Now, to bring this back to Mexico, I'm curious, what do we know about the Mexican government's current spending policies? Are they prioritizing investments in productive areas, or are they focused more on consumption-based spending?
That's a complex question, and I don't have access to the specific details of Mexico's current budget breakdown. However, it's worth noting that governments around the world are facing difficult decisions as they try to balance the need to support their economies with the risks of rising inflation.
Right. And in the case of Mexico, they're also grappling with the impact of global events like the bird flu outbreak and the potential consequences of Banco de Mexico's dovish monetary policy.
Exactly. It's a challenging economic environment, both domestically and globally.
Now, before we move on to our final thoughts, I want to take a step back and revisit a key concept we discussed earlier: global interconnectedness. We've talked about how events in one part of the world can have far-reaching consequences, from the impact of bird flu on egg prices to the potential ripple effects of a weaker Mexican peso.
Right. And it's important to remember that this interconnectedness extends beyond economic factors. Political events, social trends, and technological advancements can all have interconnected consequences that shape the global landscape.
I completely agree. And I think it's crucial for our listeners to cultivate a global mindset, to stay informed about events happening around the world, and to understand how these events might impact their own lives, even if those connections aren't immediately obvious.
It's about recognizing that we're all part of a larger, interconnected system. And the more we understand those connections, the better equipped we'll be to navigate the complexities of today's world.
Well said. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to revisit one final point from the article: expert predictions for the future of the Mexican economy. We've discussed economists' forecasts for further interest rate cuts and the potential consequences of those cuts. But I'm curious, are there any other expert perspectives or predictions that we should consider?
Yes, the article mentioned that analysts surveyed by Citibank estimate annual headline inflation at the end of February to reach 3.8%.
Right, and we discussed how that's slightly higher than the current rate, but still within Banco de Mexico's target range.
Exactly. It's something to keep an eye on, but it doesn't necessarily signal an alarming trend at this point.
Now I'm curious, are there any other expert opinions or insights that weren't mentioned in the article, but that you think are worth considering?
Yes. I think it's important to consider the potential impact of geopolitical events on the Mexican economy. For example, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and the resulting global energy crisis could have implications for Mexico's energy costs and overall economic stability.
That's an excellent point. Geopolitical events can create a lot of uncertainty and volatility in global markets, and Mexico is certainly not immune to those forces.
And we also need to consider the potential impact of climate change on the Mexican economy.
Yeah.
Mexico is a country that is particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change, from droughts to hurricanes.
Right, and these climate-related events can disrupt agricultural production, damage infrastructure, and displace populations, all of which can have significant economic consequences.
Exactly. So when we're thinking about the future of the Mexican economy, we need to consider these long-term challenges as well as the more immediate economic trends that we've been discussing.
I completely agree. It's a complex and multifaceted landscape.
It is. And it highlights the importance of adopting a holistic and forward-thinking approach when analyzing economic trends and making investment decisions.
Now, before we move on to our final thoughts, I want to take a moment to synthesize all of the information we've covered in this deep dive. We've discussed a wide range of topics, from headline and core inflation to bird flu, interest rate cuts, expert predictions, and the potential impact of geopolitical events and climate change.
It's been a comprehensive exploration of the Mexican economy.
Now, I want to make sure we're leaving our listeners with a clear and concise understanding of the key takeaways from this discussion. So, to that end, I'm going to highlight what I see as the three most important points to remember.
Sounds good.
First, even seemingly small economic shifts can have surprising and far-reaching ripple effects. We saw this with the impact of bird flu in the U.S. on egg prices in Mexico. Second, global interconnectedness is a key factor shaping the Mexican economy, and events happening around the world can have significant consequences for Mexico, both positive and negative. Third, uncertainty is a constant in economics, and we need to be prepared for unexpected events and changing trends.
Those are excellent points.
Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to turn it over to you and ask, what stands out to you as the most important takeaway for our listener?
For me, the most important takeaway is the need to think critically and stay informed. The world is becoming increasingly complex and interconnected, and it's more important than ever to be able to analyze information, connect the dots, and make informed decisions.
I couldn't agree more, and I think that's a great note to end on. But before we say goodbye, I want to ask you one more question. We've talked a lot about the challenges and uncertainties facing the Mexican economy. But I'm curious, are there any reasons for optimism? Are there any positive trends or developments that you see on the horizon?
That's a great question. And despite the challenges, there are definitely reasons for optimism. Mexico has a young and growing population, a vibrant entrepreneurial spirit, and a strategic location that positions it well.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
For trade and investment.
Those are all positive factors.
Exactly. And the Mexican government is also taking steps to strengthen the economy, from investing in infrastructure to promoting innovation and entrepreneurship.
So while there are certainly challenges ahead, there are also reasons to believe that Mexico has a bright future.
I agree. And I think that's an important message to leave our listeners with.
Well said. And on that note, we're going to wrap up part 1 of our deep dive into the Mexican economy. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll delve deeper into some of the specific challenges and opportunities facing Mexico in the years ahead.
Looking forward to it. Welcome back to our deep dive into the Mexican economy. Before we shift our focus, I'd like to pick up on your point about the Mexican government's efforts to strengthen the economy.
Yeah, absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in the challenges, but it's equally important to acknowledge the positive developments and the proactive steps being taken.
Precisely. And one area where the Mexican government has been focusing its efforts is infrastructure development.
That's interesting. Why is infrastructure development such a key focus? What kind of impact can it have on the economy?
Investing in infrastructure can have a wide range of positive economic effects. For example, improved transportation networks can make it easier for businesses to transport goods and services, reducing costs and boosting efficiency.
Right. Better roads, railways, and ports can connect businesses to new markets, both domestically and internationally, opening up opportunities for growth and expansion.
Exactly. And it's not just about transportation. Investments in energy infrastructure, such as renewable energy projects, can help to reduce Mexico's reliance on fossil fuels, which can have positive environmental and economic benefits.
That makes sense. Renewable energy sources can reduce energy costs for businesses and households, making the Mexican economy more competitive and sustainable.
They also create new jobs in the renewable energy sector, contributing to overall economic growth.
So it seems like infrastructure development is a win-win situation. It can stimulate economic activity in the short term by creating jobs and boosting demand, while also laying the foundation for long-term sustainable growth.
It is. And it's a strategy that many countries around the world are embracing as they seek to build more resilient and competitive economies.
Now, shifting gears a bit, I'm also curious about the role of innovation and entrepreneurship in the Mexican economy. You mentioned that the Mexican government is promoting these areas as well.
They are, and for good reason. Fostering a culture of innovation and entrepreneurship can be a powerful engine for economic growth.
Right. It's about creating an environment where new ideas can flourish, where people are encouraged to take risks and start new businesses.
Exactly. And Mexico has a lot of potential in this area. It has a young and dynamic population, a growing tech sector, and a vibrant entrepreneurial spirit.
So the ingredients are there for a thriving innovation ecosystem.
They are. And the government is taking steps to support this growth by investing in education and research, providing funding and mentorship for startups, and creating a more business-friendly regulatory environment.
Those are all important steps.
Yeah.
But what are some of the specific areas where Mexico is seeing innovation and entrepreneurial activity take root?
One area that's particularly exciting is the fintech sector. Mexico has a large unbanked population, and fintech startups are developing innovative solutions to provide financial services to this underserved market.
That's fascinating. So they're leveraging technology to bridge the gap in financial inclusion, making financial services more accessible and affordable for a wider segment of the population.
Exactly. And that can have a ripple effect throughout the economy, empowering individuals, boosting small businesses, and driving economic growth.
It's a great example of how innovation can be used to address social challenges while also creating economic opportunities.
And we're also seeing a lot of innovation in other sectors, such as e-commerce, healthcare, and agriculture.
It sounds like Mexico is on the cusp of a really exciting period of growth and transformation, driven by innovation and entrepreneurship.
I think so. And it's important to remember that economic development isn't just about numbers and statistics. It's about people, their ideas, their aspirations, and their ability to create a better future for themselves and their communities.
Well said, and I think that's a great point to emphasize. But before we get too carried away with optimism, let's circle back to some of the challenges facing the Mexican economy. We've touched on a few already, such as the potential impact of inflation, a weaker peso, and global economic uncertainty. But are there any other challenges that we should be aware of?
There are. One challenge that Mexico continues to face is income inequality. Despite economic growth in recent years, the gap between the rich and the poor remains wide.
Right, and income inequality can have a number of negative consequences, from social unrest to reduced economic growth.
Exactly. It can create a cycle of poverty and limit opportunities for a significant portion of the population.
And what steps is the Mexican government taking to address this challenge? Are there any policies or programs in place to reduce income inequality and promote social mobility?
There are. The Mexican government has implemented a number of social programs aimed at reducing poverty and inequality, such as conditional cash transfer programs that provide financial assistance to low-income families in exchange for meeting certain requirements, like keeping their children in school.
Those types of programs can be very effective in breaking the cycle of poverty and investing in human capital.
They can. And the government is also working to improve access to education and healthcare, which are essential for social mobility and economic empowerment.
Those are all important steps.
Yes.
But addressing income inequality is a complex challenge that requires a multifaceted approach.
It does. And it's an ongoing process that requires sustained effort and commitment from both the government and the private sector.
Now, in addition to income inequality, are there any other challenges that we should be considering?
Yes, another challenge facing the Mexican economy is corruption. Corruption can erode trust in institutions, discourage investment, and hinder economic growth.
It can create an uneven playing field for businesses, stifle innovation, and undermine the rule of law.
Exactly, and it's a challenge that many countries around the world grapple with.
And what steps is the Mexican government taking to address corruption? Are there any initiatives in place to promote transparency and accountability?
There are. The Mexican government has created anti-corruption agencies and implemented reforms aimed at strengthening transparency and accountability.
Those are important steps. But like income inequality, tackling corruption is a long-term challenge that requires sustained effort and a commitment to systemic change.
It does. And it's a challenge that requires the participation of all stakeholders, from government officials to business leaders to ordinary citizens.
Now, before we move on to our next topic, I want to take a moment to acknowledge something important. We've been discussing some complex and challenging issues, but it's important to remember that economics is not just about numbers and statistics. It's about people's lives, their livelihoods, and their hopes for the future.
I completely agree. And it's important to approach these discussions with empathy and a recognition that economic policies can have a profound impact on individuals and communities.
Well said. Now, shifting gears a bit, I'm curious to hear your perspective on another important aspect of the Mexican economy: trade. Mexico is a major trading nation, with strong ties to both the United States and Canada through the USMCA trade agreement. That's right. Trade plays a vital role in the Mexican economy, providing access to new markets for Mexican businesses and creating jobs.
And what are some of the key products that Mexico exports?
Mexico is a major exporter of manufactured goods, including automobiles, electronics, and machinery.
Right. And it's also a significant exporter of agricultural products, such as fruits, vegetables, and livestock.
Exactly. Mexico's diverse economy and strategic location make it a competitive player in the global marketplace.
Now, we've talked about the USMCA trade agreement. Can you elaborate on how this agreement has impacted the Mexican economy?
The USMCA, which replaced NAFTA, has continued to strengthen trade ties between Mexico, the United States, and Canada.
And what are some of the key provisions of the USMCA that have been particularly beneficial for Mexico? The USMCA includes provisions aimed at strengthening labor standards, environmental protections, and intellectual property rights.
Right, and those provisions can help to create a more level playing field for businesses and promote fair competition.
Exactly. The USMCA also includes provisions aimed at modernizing trade rules and facilitating digital trade, which can help to boost economic growth in all three countries.
So it seems like the USMCA has been a positive development for the Mexican economy, reinforcing trade relationships and promoting economic integration.
It has, and it's an important reminder of the benefits of free trade and open markets.
But free trade can also have its downsides, right? There are concerns about job displacement, environmental degradation, and the exploitation of workers.
There are, and it's important to acknowledge these concerns and to work towards mitigating any negative impacts of trade.
Absolutely. It's about finding a balance between the benefits of free trade and the need to protect workers, the environment, and local communities.
Exactly. And that requires a thoughtful and nuanced approach to trade policy.
Now, shifting gears a bit, I'm curious to hear your perspective on another important aspect of the Mexican economy: tourism. Mexico is a world-renowned tourist destination with beautiful beaches, ancient ruins, vibrant cities, and a rich cultural heritage.
That's right. Tourism is a major industry in Mexico, generating significant revenue and creating jobs.
And what are some of the key factors that have contributed to Mexico's success as a tourist destination?
Mexico's diverse offerings, from its natural beauty to its cultural richness, are a major draw for tourists from around the world.
Right. And Mexico has also invested heavily in its tourism infrastructure, from airports and highways to hotels and resorts.
Exactly. And the Mexican government has actively promoted tourism, showcasing Mexico's attractions and cultural heritage to the world.
Those are all important factors. But what are some of the challenges facing the tourism industry in Mexico?
One challenge is the perception of safety and security, particularly in certain regions of the country.
Right. And the COVID-19 pandemic has also had a significant impact on the tourism industry globally, including in Mexico.
It has. Travel restrictions and concerns about the virus have led to a sharp decline in tourist arrivals.
But as the pandemic recedes and travel restrictions ease, there is optimism that the tourism industry will rebound.
There is. And the Mexican government is taking steps to support the recovery of the tourism sector, including implementing health and safety protocols and promoting domestic tourism.
Those are all positive steps. Now, before we move on to our next topic, I want to take a step back and revisit a key concept we've touched on throughout our discussion: uncertainty.
Right. We've talked about how uncertainty is a constant in economics and how it can make it difficult to predict future trends and make informed decisions.
Exactly. And we've seen examples of this uncertainty in the context of the Mexican economy, from the impact of the bird flu outbreak to the potential consequences of Banco de Mexico's monetary policy decisions.
And it's important to remember that this uncertainty is not unique to Mexico. It's a global phenomenon that is shaping economic trends and policy decisions around the world.
Absolutely. So, given this uncertainty, how can we approach economic analysis and decision-making in a way that acknowledges and accounts for these unknown factors?
That's a great question, and I think one key approach is to focus on building resilience.
Resilience, what does that mean in an economic context?
Economic resilience refers to the ability of an economy to withstand and recover from shocks and disruptions.
So it's about being prepared for the unexpected, having systems in place to mitigate risks, and being able to adapt to changing circumstances.
Exactly. And there are a number of steps that countries can take to enhance their economic resilience. Diversifying their economies, reducing their reliance on any single industry or trading partner.
Right. Having a more diverse range of industries and trading partners can help to cushion the blow if one sector or partner experiences difficulties.
Investing in education and training, developing a skilled and adaptable workforce.
That makes sense. A highly skilled workforce can adapt to new technologies, industries, and market demands.
Promoting innovation and entrepreneurship, fostering a dynamic and adaptable economy.
Right. Encouraging new ideas and businesses can lead to the creation of new industries and job opportunities.
And strengthening social safety nets, providing support for those who are most vulnerable to economic shocks.
Those are all important steps. And they underscore the fact that economic resilience is not just about macroeconomic policies, it's also about social policies and investments in human capital.
Absolutely. It's about creating a society that is adaptable, inclusive, and capable of weathering the inevitable storms that come its way.
Now, before we move on to our final thoughts, I want to circle back to a topic we touched on earlier: the Mexican government's efforts to strengthen the economy. We discussed infrastructure development, promoting innovation and entrepreneurship, and addressing challenges like income inequality and corruption. But are there any other initiatives or policies that you think are worth highlighting?
Yes, I think it's worth mentioning the Mexican government's efforts to attract foreign investment.
Right. Foreign investment can play an important role in economic growth, providing capital for new businesses, creating jobs, and bringing in new technologies and expertise.
Exactly. And the Mexican government has been working to create a more attractive investment climate, streamlining regulations, improving infrastructure, and promoting Mexico's strengths as a business destination.
Those are all positive steps.
Yeah.
But what are some of the specific sectors where Mexico is seeing significant foreign investment?
Mexico has been attracting foreign investment in a range of sectors, including manufacturing, automotive, aerospace, and renewable energy.
Those are all high-growth sectors with the potential to create good-paying jobs and drive economic development.
They are. And Mexico's strategic location, skilled workforce, and competitive costs make it an attractive destination for foreign companies looking to expand their operations.
Now, we've talked about the potential benefits of foreign investment, but are there any concerns or challenges associated with foreign investment that we should be aware of?
There are. One concern is that foreign investment can sometimes lead to the exploitation of workers or environmental degradation if proper safeguards aren't in place.
Right. It's important to ensure that foreign investment is responsible and sustainable, benefiting both the investors and the host country.
Exactly. And it's important for governments to have clear regulations and enforcement mechanisms in place to protect workers, the environment, and local communities.
Now, before we move on to our final thoughts, I want to revisit a topic that's been woven throughout our discussion, the global economic landscape. We've talked about how global events, from the bird flu outbreak to the conflict in Ukraine, can impact the Mexican economy.
Right. And it's important to remember that the Mexican economy is not immune to these global forces. It's interconnected with the rest of the world through trade, investment, and financial markets.
Exactly. So, given this interconnectedness, how can we better understand and anticipate the potential impact of global events on the Mexican economy?
I think one key approach is to develop a deeper understanding of global economic trends and geopolitical risks.
Right. It's about staying informed about what's happening in the world, analyzing how those events might impact different countries and industries, and identifying potential risks and opportunities.
Exactly. And it's also important to consider the potential spillover effects of global events.
Spillover effects. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Spillover effects refer to the ways in which events in one country or region can impact other countries or regions.
So, for example, the conflict in Ukraine is having spillover effects on energy prices, supply chains, and global financial markets, which can, in turn, impact the Mexican economy.
Exactly. And those spillover effects can be complex and unpredictable, making it even more important to stay informed and adaptable.
Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to turn it over to you and ask what stands out to you as the most important takeaway for our listener regarding the Mexican economy's place in the global landscape.
For me, the most important takeaway is the need to adopt a global mindset. The Mexican economy is not an island. It's part of a complex and interconnected global system. And to truly understand the forces shaping the Mexican economy, we need to look beyond its borders and consider the global context.
Well said. And I think that's a great point to emphasize. Now, before we move on to our final thoughts, I want to revisit a topic that we've touched on throughout our discussion, uncertainty. We've talked about how uncertainty is a constant in economics and how it can make it difficult to predict future trends and make informed decisions.
Right. We've seen examples of this uncertainty in the context of the Mexican economy, from the impact of the bird flu outbreak to the potential consequences of Banco de Mexico's monetary policy decisions.
And we've also talked about how uncertainty is a global phenomenon that's shaping economic trends and policy decisions around the world. But given this uncertainty, how can we approach economic analysis and decision-making in a way that acknowledges and accounts for these unknown factors?
That's a great question, and I think one key approach is to focus on scenario planning.
Scenario planning. Can you explain what that is?
Scenario planning is a process of thinking about different possible futures and developing plans for how to respond to those different scenarios.
So instead of trying to predict the future with certainty, which is often impossible, we consider a range of possible outcomes and develop strategies for each one.
Exactly. And this can help us to be more prepared for the unexpected and more adaptable to changing circumstances.
That makes sense. But how do we go about developing these different scenarios? Where do we start?
A good starting point is to identify the key uncertainties that could have a significant impact on the issue or decision at hand.
So in the context of the Mexican economy, some of those key uncertainties might include things like global economic growth, commodity prices, trade policies, and geopolitical events.
Exactly. Once we've identified those key uncertainties, we can start to develop different scenarios by considering how those uncertainties might play out.
For example, we might develop a scenario where global economic growth is strong, commodity prices are stable, trade policies are favorable, and geopolitical risks are low.
And we might also develop a scenario where global economic growth is weak, commodity prices are volatile, trade policies are protectionist, and geopolitical risks are high.
Right. And by considering these different scenarios, we can start to think about the potential implications for the Mexican economy. and develop strategies for how to respond to those different outcomes.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that scenario planning is not about predicting the future with certainty. It's about exploring possibilities, challenging assumptions, and being prepared for a range of potential outcomes.
Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to turn it over to you and ask what stands out to you as the most important takeaway for our listener regarding this topic of scenario planning.
For me, the most important takeaway is that uncertainty is not something to be feared. It's simply a reality of the world we live in. And by embracing uncertainty and incorporating it into our decision-making processes, we can actually make better, more informed choices.
That's a great point, and I think that's a great note to end on for this part of our deep dive into the Mexican economy. Stay tuned for the final part, where we'll synthesize all of the information we've covered and leave you with some key takeaways and thought-provoking questions to consider. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into the Mexican economy. We've covered a lot of ground, from inflation and interest rates to global interconnectedness and scenario planning.
It's been quite a journey, exploring both the challenges and the opportunities that lie ahead for Mexico.
It really has, and I'm hoping our listeners now have a more nuanced understanding of what shapes Mexico's economy. But we've covered so much, so let's take a moment to really distill what we've learned. Some key takeaways. What do you think?
Sounds good. What comes to mind first for you?
Well, for me, it's just how interconnected the world truly is.
Yeah.
Like, who could have imagined that bird flu in the U.S. could impact the price of eggs in Mexico?
You're right. It really shows how events happening far away can have these ripple effects on our everyday lives in ways we might never even think about. Whether it's a health crisis or a geopolitical conflict or even just a shift in global trade, these things can influence everything from grocery prices to how stable our financial systems are.
Absolutely. And it means we can't just ignore what's happening in other parts of the world. We have to stay informed about global events and really consider how they might impact economies everywhere, including our own.
And like we've talked about, understanding these global connections requires a critical and analytical way of thinking. It's not enough to just read headlines. We need to really dig deep, connect those dots, and think about the potential consequences of different events and trends.
Right. And I think that's where scenario planning comes in. In a world where things are always changing, being able to think about different possible futures and plan for each of them is a really valuable skill to have.
Absolutely. It encourages us to be proactive, not just reacting to events as they happen, but thinking ahead about how we might shape the future. It's about being prepared for anything, not just the most likely outcome, but for a whole range of possibilities, both good and bad.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that's a key takeaway for anyone trying to understand not just the Mexican economy, but really any economy in today's globalized world.
Definitely. One more thing I wanted to touch on is the role of government, something that's come up throughout our conversations. We've talked about how government policies like interest rate decisions or infrastructure investments can really shape the economy.
Right. And we've also talked about how challenging it can be for governments to balance different priorities, like boosting the economy while keeping inflation under control.
Exactly. And those challenges become even more complex in our interconnected world, where domestic policies can be affected by things happening globally.
It's a lot to think about. So how can our listeners take what we've learned and apply it to their own lives and the decisions they make?
I think the most important thing is to be informed and engaged. Pay attention to economic news, both in your own country and around the world. Think critically about the information you're getting and try to see things from different perspectives. And don't be afraid to ask questions and challenge the assumptions you might have.
Really great advice. And remember, understanding the economy isn't just about making money or investments. It's about understanding the world we live in and where we fit into it. It's about making informed choices, having meaningful conversations, and helping to create a better and more sustainable future for everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Nah.
Well, I think that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the Mexican economy. I hope this has been insightful and given you all some food for thought.
It certainly has for me. I want to thank you for joining us on this journey. We encourage everyone to keep learning, stay curious, and keep talking about what's shaping our world. Thanks for listening.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.